and welcome to this special episode of Voices Unveiled, an audio podcast by Women for Biodiversity, where we share women's stories from different corners of the world. I'm your host, Sumina. Today, I have the absolute pleasure of talking with Dr. Susan Gardner. She is the director of the United Nations Environment Programs, or UNEP's Ecosystems Division, and she's speaking to us from Nairobi, Kenya. For more than 30 years, Dr. Gardner has been right at the heart of some of the biggest global conversations on nature, climate, and sustainable development. Her work has crossed oceans and borders, shaped international policy, and continues to inspire countless women and girls in science. As she reflects on her journey, Dr. Gardner is refreshingly candid about the moments of quiet self-doubt she felt walking into a room full of men, a feeling many of us as women know all too well. But in our conversation, we explore everything from restoring degraded lands to protecting oceans, from the deep connections between gender equality, Indigenous rights, and environmental action, to why Dr. Gardner remains hopeful about the next generation of young women and girls who are ready to take up the mantle. So make yourself comfortable and join us for this honest and candid conversation with Dr. Susan Gardner. Trust me, you're going to want to hear this. But before we begin, please subscribe and follow Women for Biodiversity. Our handles are in the description box. Thank you, Ms. Susan. Thank you for joining us from Nairobi. You have dedicated your career to environmental conservation. So I wanted to know what inspired you to work in this field, and how has your background in marine science shaped your perspective on today's environmental challenges as well?
Well, hello, Sumina, and it's a real pleasure to have the chance to talk to you and have a chance to share some insights through this conversation with your audience of biodiversity leaders, both present and future. I can remember being, in my early 20s and 30s, and thinking about sort of where I wanted my career to go, because it does evolve over the decades as a young scientist. I've heard, other speakers that you've had on your podcast have talked about being attracted to biodiversity because initially it was the animals, right? I've heard that a few different times. And I remember certainly for me at the beginning of my education, really having that draw to those charismatic megafauna, the dolphins and the whales and manatees and things that, I wanted to get close to them. And so I think initially I was really drawn to the idea of just the proximity to working with these extraordinary, amazing animals. And I was always just particularly interested in the marine and aquatic life and the fish and the beautiful colors. And I was really fortunate, I think, in two ways. One was that I had parents who appreciated the value of both environmentalism, but also science. And so they immediately supported me in my interest in science and in nature. And then I had opportunities also to, as a young undergraduate, to do internships where I actually got to work closely with dolphins. And I actually got to go and take classes where the whole course was underwater. So we had, underwater slates where we would take notes. This was before computers, if you can believe it. This was in the 80s. And so we would go and take notes underwater. We would point to species and learn the taxonomy and understand how all the different species were related to each other, how the ecosystems function by actually being in there and observing it. And so that was my early beginning of my career, as sort of from the academic standpoint, but not too different than what I've also heard from some of your other podcasts. My interest in working as a marine scientist evolved the more that I got close to these species, the more that I began to understand them and truly be interested in learning about them, the more I wanted to figure out what I could be doing to help them. So I immediately sort of shifted from just wanting to be close to them to actually saying, well, what can I do to help them? You start to recognize there's real risks to these species. And so I saw at the time that pollution was one of the big problems, one of the big concerns, especially for, a coastal marine environment. And so I got a master's in toxicology and then turned that into a PhD in fisheries, where I looked at those interactions between the chemicals that we produce, whether that's, the mercury that we put into the air that ends up into aquatic food chains, or whether it's chemicals that we used in pesticides. All of that gets accumulated through marine food webs. And so I became very interested in understanding those interactions. And this led me to wanting to know, okay, well, so, studying these things, like many scientists, I was producing reports and publishing data and working with students to help, bring forward the next generation of scientists. And then I began to say, well, but how is all this science getting used, right? We're producing a lot of data. It's out there. Like, how is this actually getting used to change policies? And so then I began to really want to be part of the policy process. What is it that creates a new law on a national level, or how much science is needed to get to the point where we can agree internationally to have a new treaty? And so that led me to international work, where I began to work first as part of negotiations for different governments, but then later coming to the UN, where I wanted to see not only how do we get this into law, into international regulation, but then how do we also promote action? And that's a big role that I have now at UNEP, is to ensure that we understand the problems. We have come a long way since the 80s, really in understanding the problems, recognizing the problems. And we have so many solutions. We don't have all of them, but we have a lot of them. We know what we need to do. We know what we need to do now, what the next steps are. And so then the question is, what are we doing about it? How do we promote the action on the areas where we know we can solve the problem, where in some cases we even have commitments, like under the Global Biodiversity Framework, we have commitments to take the action that we need to protect biodiversity. And so a big part of what we do in the UN Environment Program is then promoting action by helping to support countries to either have the capacity they need from the technical standpoint, or from the legislative standpoint, or helping to build political will. It's all of that that's needed across the globe to solve a lot of these problems. So that was my journey, just in terms of going from the scientist in love with the species to the UN official who's here talking to you about what do we need to do globally to solve a lot of these massive global challenges.
And what a lovely journey that has been. I was really interested about your journey as a student, when you had to undergo the course that was underwater. So that was really interesting to hear. and now and now to be at the table where global negotiations are happening, and to find solutions for this, like you said, massive challenges that all of us have contributed to. It's not a easy task to deal with. No. So yeah. So moving on. So in a recent report titled "The Ocean and Human Rights," the Special Rapporteur on the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, Astrid Puentes Riano, strongly advocated that ocean issues are human rights issues. So in your view, how can gender-responsive approaches help counter some of the biggest challenges in marine conservation and strengthen ocean protection efforts? I know it's a very long question. And also, you've recently been to the UN conference, the Ocean Conference in Nice, France as well. So
yes.
I wanted to know your view on this issue.
Well, coming back from Nice and the third UN Ocean Conference, it was clear that the attention was on getting to solutions, and there was the awareness and the understanding that takes everybody. So that means that we can't leave half the population on the sidelines while the other half goes out to try to solve the problems. It means that we need gender responsive approaches, and then we have also empowerment of all marginalized communities. That includes Indigenous people, includes young people, includes all of the actors who can be very significant in terms of bringing around action on solutions. When I was working in environmental work, working specifically with sea turtle conservation, one of the things that became really clear was that our challenges are linked across the globe because the ocean connects us all. And that's one of the amazing things about working in ocean science is that it's all connected. So, for example, the sea turtles that I was working with when I was on the Pacific coast of Mexico were coming from nesting grounds all the way across the Pacific on beaches in Japan. So these species were coming across from Japan to North America, coming down into Mexican nursery grounds, feeding grounds, where they would spend decades growing before going back to Japan for nesting again. And so what happens in Japan on a nesting beach, a decision to build a hotel and destroy a nesting beach in Japan would affect Mexican turtles. And the fisheries, coastal fisheries in Mexico could decimate Japanese turtle populations as well. And so we really began to understand the interconnections, including contaminant exposure that happens across different parts of the ocean. And so, and this is the one thing, it's the message in toxicology as well, as we learn about the chemicals that were released. For example, mercury that was put into the atmosphere from burning coal in Asia would cross the Pacific and come into North America, while the same mercury that was burnt and put into the environment from North America would go across the Atlantic and affect the food supply in Europe. And so we understood that, we began to see that these are real global challenges that take full global response. But when we degrade one part of the ocean, then it does affect, as that report showed, the human rights for everyone. So that's about our clean, healthy environment. It's about our access to food. It's about our health. And also it is about the ocean as a source of cultural and spiritual foundation for many communities. And too often when we see land and ocean and coastal degradation, there's a disproportionate effect on women and Indigenous peoples. So I think that, in terms of gender responsive approaches, the first thing we have to do is make sure that we know the facts and acknowledge the information that's available. So acknowledge that there is differences between how environmental degradation affects men and women. And we have to just recognize that we have information on this and recognize it. So for example, in fisheries, the fish work out on the water in the fishing boat is predominantly a male-dominated industry, and not entirely, but predominantly. But the work that happens back at shore, what the secondary marine-related activities like fish processing, 90% of those workers are women. So this is even the marketing, this is, that whole range of processing that happens. Often, perhaps it's the bookkeeping for the local family-owned fishing business that is going to happen at the kitchen counter after the children are bed. That it may be done by the women. These are jobs that are either unpaid or low paid very often, but they're essential. And we have to recognize the importance of that part of work and incorporate it in decision making. But yet, if you look at, the top 100 seafood companies, there's only like 1% or less that are actually run by women. We've got, more than half of them that are not even on boards. We don't even have any women at all on their boards. Forget about parity, just presence. We need to ensure that women are participating at high levels in decision making when it comes to the fishing sector, so that they can ensure that solutions incorporate the whole landscape of the industry. Because if you're only looking at what happens on the deck of the boat or in any aspect of the fishery that is male dominated, you're going to miss all of the other components, which are truly, truly essential and underappreciated. And at the same time, women also bring a different perspective in terms of solutions towards sustainable fisheries, solutions towards marine conservation. We've seen studies by the OECD that say actually women's contributions of their perspectives, their ideas, and their approaches can actually get better outcomes. So it's important to hear the voices, right, and to understand the contributions they can make as well as the vulnerabilities. And one example I think that is right, we're in the middle of right now, is the negotiation process that's happening to achieve an agreement for a plastics treaty. We are seeing, for example, that the informal sectors, like the waste pickers that are majority women, they actually collect about 60% of global plastic waste. Right? So you have this informal sector around the world made up primarily by women and really very, very important in collecting plastic waste and keeping it out of the environment. But they're working in an informal sector, which means they have no legal protection. It means that they have exposure to microplastics and chemicals, exposure to chemicals that we know gets into their bodies, we know crosses across the placenta, with very little protection. And so they are actually engaging in these negotiations as a stakeholder that has real interest in the negotiation outcome, but also has a real contribution to make to the global solutions. And they're asking for basic things like, we would like as a sector to have training. We would like to be recognized for our role. We would insist that there should be occupational safety standards to ensure that our workers are safe, that they have protected gear. These basic things. And so, these are some of the kinds of approaches. If we understand the contribution, but we also understand the vulnerabilities, we can get to solutions that actually are going to have long-term benefits for entire communities and be more effective than if we're looking at this without the gender responsive lens.
I think I agree with everything that you said. Women do bring a different perspective and different outcomes, and it's sad, but it's a fact that we live in an age of AI and everything, but we're still fighting for the most basic of things for women and girls across the world. Which brings me to my next question, that desertification and land degradation disproportionately impact women and girls. And for example, as land degrades, women and girls must travel further to collect water and firewood. So this adds to their unpaid labor and reduces their time for education, something that you've already touched upon in your previous answer as well. But drawing from your nearly 3 decades of experience in environmental policy and UNEP's work, what are some community level actions that could meaningfully involve women in land restoration and sustainable land management?
Oh, it's such an important point that you're making, because there's been a growing recognition that, as we have more food insecurity, more water insecurity, that time for education is going to be reduced because of the time just to get basic resources is going to be increased. The difficulty of trying to get enough food for for the family's table is going to be made difficult more and increased. So, I mean, I think we could just start by talking about food production because, for one thing, it's a massive contributor to land degradation as well as to climate change. We see that women are producing about half of the world's food, but yet they make up 70% of the world's hungry. So, I mean, how is this possible? This shows we have a systemic failure. There is often, in too many countries, not equal ability to access land or to have rights to land, because only about 20% of landholders globally are women. And so they're doing about half of the world's agricultural work as part of the agricultural workforce, and yet they don't have the ownership and the decision-making power over the land that they're working. And so we have seen studies that show that just last year by UN Women that shows that women are actually, with more climate instability, women are going to be pushed more into poverty than their male counterparts. But at the same time, we know that when we involve women in solutions, we actually get all kinds of benefits. So we can empower women economically through employment or through providing them more control over resources. For example, land rights. Whether or not a woman has the ability to inherit land from her husband or her father makes a huge difference. We see examples in countries where, with the death of a spouse, the in-laws get the land. And imagine, like, how do you then, what happens to that family, and what happens to the ability of the mother, the wife, the woman in that family who has actually the skill set, the knowledge and experience to produce on that land. And we know that when women are empowered, they actually, improve outcomes for their families, for their communities, for children's health, for children's nutrition, because they serve as biodiversity experts. They often are the ones that know what the weather patterns are, which crops to plant where, when to do the plantings. These are often the experts at this. And so by empowering them with either legal land ownership, or in some cases, it's more about cultural access. In some cases where women may have the legal ability, but they don't actually have access to those rights because the cultural expectations provide too much of a boundary. When we can address some of those, we can actually benefit the whole community. I had an opportunity recently to travel in Northeast India, where I met Dr. Purnima Barman, who is doing amazing work. She's a scientist who was studying stork conservation. But her research led her to understanding the solutions involved communities and community activation, but community empowerment. And so she's working with women in the community to create economic opportunities through weaving, through tourism, through working together as a community. She provided information and education for the community to understand that some of the cultural biases towards storks could be transformed into appreciation, so that storks could be seen as beautiful and as part of the ecosystem, rather than, what some historic biases against the storks had created, sort of a lack of interest or even a lack of concern about destruction of their habitat. And so through environmental education and through activism to create economic opportunities for the women in the communities, they actually became empowered to turn what was a very concerning a situation for the species into real progress on conservation. And so these are examples. By empowering women, we've got conservation of a species. So we have biodiversity improvement. We have improvements for nature because it involved protecting habitat. And we got improvement for the society and the economy of these communities. And so these are the win-win solutions that exist. They're out there. We've seen examples here in Kenya where we've worked with local communities on the coast to restore mangrove habitats, which we know that without the mangroves, fisheries will suffer. Coastal areas will be less resilient to flood surges, to storms, and restoring the mangroves that had been lost. There were actually opportunities to bring in more tourism into the areas. People became more informed. They became more of spokespeople, advocates for the work that they were doing. And they began involving actually the retired women communities. So the older women who were engaging as communicators, activists in these communities, becoming empowered because of this work. So there's so many great examples where by empowering women, we actually empower the communities. I'll give you one more example. We have work, there's an example of a farmer in Senegal. Her name is actually Joan of Arc in English, the English translation. And she has 8 children, and she's got a small 1-acre plot. And it was a monoculture farm that was just kind of a typical farmland that was mediocre productivity, and she turned it into a lush, beautiful forest garden because she was thinking about the future of her children, and she was thinking about how she would be able to provide them future food, how she could provide them nutritious food. You can't do that on a monoculture, a farmland. And so she actually created a whole variety of different crops that she could sell. And she could increase her family's income producing these different crops that not only provided nutritious value to her family and her children, she could build resilience for her family in terms of having the independent production of food, and she had extra food that she could bring to market. And so these are the kinds of solutions that make sense for the family, for the community, for the biodiversity, and for the local economy. So there's a lot of opportunities out there. We have to listen and learn from each other so that we can put more of them into action.
So Women for Biodiversity we also have something called Restore Her Rights Initiative. One of the significant things that we're trying to do is that we're trying to bring stories from various communities to show that when women lead, actual changes and long-term and sustainable changes occur in communities. Okay, so you also just spoke about how 90% of producers of food are women, but they make up 70% of the hungry, and pointed out there is a systemic failure. And I want to touch upon one of your earliest interviews as well, where you've noted that sustainability departments are often lightly resourced and overtasked. So in this slide, UNEP and FAO are jointly leading the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which aims to prevent, halt, and reverse ecosystem degradation worldwide. So what has been the biggest challenge in advancing this mission? How can an approach that meaningfully includes the voices of Indigenous peoples strengthen restoration efforts that can ensure long-term sustainability for both nature and people?
Well, I'm so glad you brought up the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, because it's such a ray of hope and opportunity. And just like what you described in terms of your women leaders, highlighting women leaders, how they're doing it, the successes they're having, also recognizing the challenges they're facing, but their achievements. It's so inspiring, right? The young women who are seeing these as role models and examples can become inspired. They can see themselves in those examples, and they can recognize that this is possible. And this is part of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration is similar, because we have highlighted areas where restoration works for the environment and for people and societies, economies. So right now, countries have already promised through various commitments to restore over 1 billion hectares worldwide. And so if you think about it, that's like the size of China. And so the commitment exists. Right? There's the recognition that restoration is the opportunity to heal the planet. I mean, it's the opportunity to improve the environment and give something to the next generation that is better than what we received from our forefathers and foremothers. I mean, that's an inspiring opportunity. That's an inspiring idea. And so the commitments exist. The question is, how do we translate that into action? And some of the obstacles are, of course, always finance. As we talked about, it can be things like land rights. Who has the ability to affect change? In some cases, it's knowledge, although we have so much science and information, this is an area where we're gaining information all the time. We need to monitor. We need to make sure that we know that what we're doing is achieving the outcomes that were intended. And there's a whole list of different principles that are outlined as part of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration that says this is how you do restoration well. And so it makes it clear that restoration, when done correctly, involves local communities, empowers people, especially those who are closest to the landscape, to benefit from the solutions. And so we have, as part of the decade, working together with FAO, we identify every year flagships of examples where somewhere in the world has been a restoration program that was hugely successful in achieving the whole range of opportunities of restoration. So engaging local communities, ensuring that it's based on sound science, that the restoration activities are understood to bring back the ecosystem services that we're looking at a whole range of different types of ecosystems at the same time. And to really engage Indigenous peoples, we have to be listening and learning from their approaches. There's so much that we can benefit from. One example is one of the UN flagships is the Living Indus initiatives in the high mountains in Pakistan. And the local Indigenous communities have knowledge and practices where they can preserve and sustain glaciers. They're recognizing that with climate change, glacier melting's increasing, it's creating instability in water supplies, it's creating horrible flooding with catastrophic effects. But there have traditional Indigenous knowledge of how to actually manage and grow glaciers and direct glacier movement towards areas where they can provide the most sustainable water resources for communities, building resilience for the local communities, but at the same time preserving important Indigenous species like the snow leopards of that region. And so by working in restoration, they're actually reviving the Indus River Basin and ensuring that communities, as well as biodiversity, are benefited. Another example in Latin America is another one of the restoration flagships in a program called Acción Andina, which is a community-led initiative to save the Andean forest. And this was work that was led by Inca community leaders who understood that for food security, as well as stabilizing water, they needed to do reforestation efforts. They understood that there had been decades of invasive species that were introduced that were not the right ones for the landscape. They were extracting all the nutrients. They were overutilizing the water. They were reducing resilience. And so they recognized that bringing back the ecosystem services that the endemic species were providing, they can actually benefit not only the indigenous biodiversity, but the indigenous people and communities from those landscapes. And so this is a major initiative that's working across more than half dozen countries to bring this restoration initiative, because it's recognized that it's so important for the communities. But it's also based on leadership from the indigenous peoples of those areas. So the way that that we can ensure that we're benefiting from all of this knowledge, these traditional practices, these true stewards of the landscape, is to remove those barriers that for too long had kept indigenous peoples away from the decision-making table. Processes that made it difficult for them to access finance. We need to ensure that in discussions that we're amplifying and giving space for the voice of indigenous peoples to contribute to solutions. And we're starting to see this happen in the multilateral frameworks. I heard one of your conversations was about some of the outcomes from the Convention on Biological Diversity's recent conference in Cali, where there was agreement to ensure that there are subsidiary bodies, there are true mechanisms for indigenous peoples to contribute information and knowledge into the work of biodiversity conservation and into the work of ensuring the progress towards the global biodiversity framework. So I think that's that combination of empowering voices and listening to the solutions that indigenous peoples bring to these global challenges is how we can ensure that everyone benefits.
These are some lovely examples that you've just shared, Ms. Susan, but I also wanted to know what has been the biggest challenge in advancing this mission?
Well, some would say that it's finance. We often hear that the problem is access to finance. But we also hear, for example, on the margins of the UN Ocean Conference, there was a meeting of the Blue Economy and Finance Forum, and it mobilized a whole number of stakeholders from finance institutions and banking, various scientist group, NGOs, a whole range of government actors, a whole range of people and stakeholders coming together to talk about solutions. And a lot of private sectors said, well, we do have finance. And they were saying, but scientists, could you please just agree? Could you agree on what we should be investing in? And they talked about de-risking their investments so that when they put their money into something, they could know that that investment has integrity, that they could feel confident in where they're investing their money. And they said to do that, it would help a lot if the scientists would agree, or at least communicate that agreement in a way where they could understand where they should be pointing towards their investments. And they, asked the NGO community to work with them as well, help them to identify where are the best opportunities, the most impactful investments that they can be focused on. So I think in some cases, while finance, yes, is lacking, the issue tends to be, one, are we helping to identify and making the right matches between the available work that needs to be done and the resources that are available? Are we ensuring that we've got the connections there so they can find each other? And we also know through the global biodiversity framework, that part of the solution on finance is about repurposing existing money. So, for example, there's subsidies that are, in the hundreds of billions of dollars level that are going towards activities that are destructive to nature. And we know that. So they're destroying the environment, which means they are actually, investing in activities that hurt people. And so instead, we can start to transform those subsidies into activities that actually are beneficial for both the environment and the economies and people. So it's not about taking money away from industries, it's about helping provide the market signals so that industries shift into nature positive activities because the subsidies have shifted into those directions. And this is part of what was agreed under the targets of the global biodiversity framework. Countries of the world said, we agree, we will shift our subsidies. By 2030, the timeframe of the global biodiversity framework. So that's a big part of the solution and the challenges. It's about getting the finance, but getting it right, helping to direct it to the right places, and ensuring that the investments are leading to ecosystem services that benefit people as well as biodiversity. And you're getting those full range of benefits. That's a big part of the challenge. But the other big part of the challenge too, I think, is ensuring that we create the space for different voices to come into the conversations when decisions are being made, and where the solutions can be contributed. And that's something that I think we're seeing a lot of progress on now, but that momentum has to continue.
Absolutely, and let's hope that all of our combined efforts actually do yield fruitful results for everybody. Thank you again, Ms. Susan, for sharing so much of knowledge and so much of interesting stories and your anecdotes from your travels and from your experiences as a student, as part of as being a UN official. But now I also want to ask you, as a woman marine scientist, you have likely witnessed the gender gap in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, what's also known as STEM. So what challenges do women in marine science and conservation still face today, and what gives you hope to continue the fight every day? And this is going to be my last question for the day.
Okay, well, it's been a pleasure talking with you, and thank you for asking such interesting questions. There's a study recently by UNESCO looking at gender and science, and in ocean science, women make up about 38% of the scientists. It's not equal, but it's about 10% higher than science overall. So ocean science is a little better than a lot of the other science areas. But we do know that, like, for example, just looking at biology more generally, as students, even from the undergraduate, even up to the doctoral levels, often there is gender balance. So there may be similar, gender parity. But then when you start to get into the doctoral level, you start to see the level of women decreasing. And then as you get into tenure track, professional professor positions at universities, decreasing even further. Once you look at sort of in academic positions, like a full professor position, you might go from that range from, a student where you have 50-50 down to full professors where you get down to only about 25% are women at that point. So we're losing women throughout the process. So women are coming into science as students and then getting lost along the way. There was a study just earlier this year that was tracking about more than 80,000 scientists. And they were looking at what happens 20 years after your first publication. And it shows that only 26% of women in biology-related fields remain active in their research. I mean, how do you lose 75% of your workforce after they produce their first publication? So, there is, of course, trends downward for both men and women, but the rate of loss for women is higher. And so that's been something throughout my career that I have been interested in. I remember seeing seminars even back as a graduate student in the 90s, wondering, what was it? Why are we losing so many women across our careers? One of the things that, because I had the opportunity to work internationally from the beginning of my career, we did have seen in studies that it's very important as part of your career as a scientist to get international recognition. So it means that by going to international conferences, you're presenting your research to a broader audience. And that's how you get recognized for international awards and prizes. And gaining that international recognition is what allows you then to be competitive for promotions. But that requires international travel, and that can be hard to do for women who are in cultural situations where they're expected to be the primary caregiver, unless, of course, there's someone else available to help share with these responsibilities. Just aspects like being able to be away from the home or the family for periods of time could be something that can restrict some women in some cultural settings. And one of the things that I've tried to do at different times in my career was to see if we could set up networks of women scientists, so that these networks of women can get to know each other, can share examples of their work, can promote each other's work, can publish together, to create these big collaborations, so that if not all of them can go and present the work, they can at least be presenting on each other's behalf. I was involved in creating an award for women scientists as part of an ASEAN award that was, ASEAN has a science and technology committee, or at least it used to. I haven't looked recently. And so we created a Women's Science Award, especially for young women scientists, to try to give them that early recognition in a way so that they can really have a chance to stand out, for these best scientists to have this opportunity to get recognition in ways that will be very important in their future promotion. It depends. That we've seen differences, that gap differs with different fields of science. I think in more of the engineering fields, women only make up about a quarter of the undergraduate degrees, and less than that are even practicing engineers. So in some fields like engineering, you have much fewer women, whereas in other types of biology fields, you will see more women. It depends on the field. I think some of that has to do with what is the culture? Do women feel welcome? Do they feel like they belong in those fields? One of the things we have to do is ensure that on interview panels that there are a diversity of people who sit on that interview panel that look like that reflect the diversity of the people being interviewed. Because I know for myself, when I've sat in front of an all-male interview panel, even if you tell yourself different psychologically, you're saying, I don't belong in that group. I don't see myself in that group. And that right there can reduce your confidence, reduce your ability to really, perform at your best, and sort of reduce your resilience to say, I got staying power. I'm going to stay because I belong, because they want me here. There's a whole range of things, but that, we're still working to improve. But I do feel very hopeful that this is getting better. I've seen, in this next generation, a lot of your listeners are these young leaders who are just already stepping up and saying, look, we see what needs to get done, and we're just going to do it. We're not waiting around for permission from anybody. And that, to me is very inspiring. I have a daughter who's in her 20s, and she just inspires me every day because I see how she works with other women and how, using the ability that you all have in terms of being able to use technology to share information, you guys can support each other. And because you can create these networks, the next generation of women can ensure that they are feeling that support. It's clear that we have urgency to act, and I feel very confident that young women are going to be, this generation of women now, these Gen Zs, are stepping up to ensure that they're taking control of their futures, and they are informed and they are connected. And that gives me a tremendous amount of hope that those women scientists are going to feel the support they need to have the resilience and the staying power, and really be the leaders of the future.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. If you'd like to connect with us, follow Women for Biodiversity on social media. The handles are in the description box, and please don't hesitate to share this episode. The more the merrier. You can reach us at communications@womenforbiodiversity.org. Remember, that's the number 4 instead of FOR. So until the next episode, stay strong and carry on.